All right. And so we're going to talk tonight about the history of the Nativity and hopefully give ourselves a deeper understanding of the story and the world into which Jesus of Nazareth was born. Whatever your religious persuasion might be, the story of the Nativity has been one of the fundamental stories of the Western tradition. And it's been studied by thousands of people throughout many years. Even today, at this time of year, all around the world, people are celebrating and preparing for Christmas to celebrate this story. So it's important that we understand this story and know some of the history behind it. But I'm going to start on a Christmas story in a rather strange place. On August 4th at 1 p.m. in 79 AD, during the time of the Roman Empire, when many of Jesus' original disciples and apostles were still living and still spreading the good news, as they called it, of his gospel around the world, Mount Vesuvius in southern Italy exploded in a cataclysmic Plinian eruption, 3 times more powerful than the eruption that destroyed Mount St. Helens. The power of the blast immediately pulverized the top 1,000 feet of the mountain and pulverized it down to dust and sent plumes of smoke 25 miles into the air. The explosion was so loud it could be heard as far away as Alexandria, Egypt. And at its base, the twin Roman cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum, within a matter of hours, were covered in 50 feet of volcanic dust and mud. And these cities were thought lost forever. The places where they'd been in the green hillsides of Colombia outside of what is today Naples became a wasteland of ash. And these cities were thought gone forever until, at the end of the 18th century, a farmer digging in the volcanic soil near the Bay of Naples was digging down with a drill, and as he broke through the layer of volcanic rock underneath, his drill bit fell through into open space. And that began an excavation that's been going on for almost 200 years at Pompeii. And what we found at Pompeii was the city itself was not actually destroyed, at least not entirely by the flames and by the eruption, but rather it was buried under this volcanic ash, which managed to freeze everything in that city at one moment in time. And it preserved it. So as archaeologists dug this up, they found, for instance, bakeries with bread still in the ovens. Table settings with food still on the table, uneaten by the people who were there at the time. All these beautiful works of art. They found frescoes that were half painted and still left with the bowls of paint that the artist left on the floor as he fled the building. These glass vases were sitting in a storefront window, and you can see they were warped by the heat of the volcanic ash that came in. Instead, what we found, rather than a waste, was an entire city preserved, a moment in time frozen. And we found people still frozen in the moments of their death. Right? This man, you can still see his expression as he looks up to see the shower of flame falling down where he was. A woman crawling into her home, almost making it across the threshold and staying. This man was loading a cart full of goods when he was buried. This family had this cute little mosaic in their house, right, of a beloved family dog, and not far away, a family huddled together, trying to escape in the basement of their home. I think my favorite one, and I couldn't find a good picture of it, there's one, and there's an old man, you can tell his limbs are frail and he's bald, and he's leaning forward and he has his face in his hands, and he's sitting down on the curb beside the street, and he's weeping as fire literally rains down from the sky and ends everything that he ever knew. In seeing this, you can realize that they were much like us today. Because this investigation and this excavation that's been happening at the city of Pompeii has been going on since this time. And if you travel there today, you could walk down the streets of an ancient Roman city. Ironically, most of this damage is not even from the volcano itself, but because the site's been exposed to the elements for almost 100 years. And you can walk down and see this. And what they found at Pompeii has revolutionized what we knew about the Roman Empire. And we found that the Romans were far more advanced than any of our historians had thought until we studied this. If you were in Pompeii, for example, Pompeii had a stock market where people could invest their money. Many Roman homes had hot and cold running water. They found things, they even found little steam engines, right? They'd invented steam engines, except they never figured out, I guess, how to make them large enough to power the things that we use today. They were just used as little children's toys that putted around the house with a little tinderbox. We found that Romans, much like us today, were obsessed with celebrity culture. And almost everywhere you go, you could see famous athletes and famous actors, right, endorsing various products. Or, as celebrities always want to do, right, always out speaking for one politician or another that they wanted us to support. They also found in Herculaneum what I think we today would call a super Walmart, right? A giant indoor structure that had one section devoted to fresh groceries, another area of it to housewares and to clothing, right? All of this giant indoor structure, and all of it was built by a woman who had made millions in a dry cleaning franchise. It really is remarkable when we see them, the similarities till today. So why do I start a Christmas story talking about Pompeii and talking about this? Well, it's only to highlight the fact that whether you can attribute it to the providence and wisdom of a divine God or just to sheer dumb luck, Jesus of Nazareth was born at a pivotal moment in history, at a time in which his message could spread, a time where humanity had achieved a peak of technology and culture that it would not achieve again until modern times. If you had a time machine and had to decide when to go back and when to live, I don't think you could do better than selecting right in that first century where Jesus was born. Had Jesus been born only 100 years before, he would likely have spent his time as some obscure prophet in a tiny area, trapped between many empires, his message unable to really be spread. Had he been born 100 years later, then Christianity would have emerged into a Roman Empire that was fractured by civil war and in decline. And its message, and it would be competing with the many other ideas, with barbarian hordes, and it could not have spread and become the religion that it did. Instead, Jesus was born at a perfect moment in history, at the beginning of what we know of as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. A 200-year mark of history started with the reign of Augustus Caesar. And for that 200 years, Rome would know peace, stability, prosperity, and wealth that would be the model of the world. The reason why people throughout the Middle Ages and all the way up until our founding fathers here in America paid so much attention and read so much about the Romans was it was clear to them from reading and looking at the ruins of what the Romans left behind that there had been a time when it was better than it was. And that was true of the Romans all the way up until today in our modern times. And so we can attribute this, but certainly Jesus, if you could choose a time to be born, he chose possibly the best time. So his missionaries who would go out to spread his message after his death would find roads leading them to well-developed cities, peace and stability, and mostly a government that was largely tolerant of religions and let people believe. A unit where most of the world, as we could see it, spoke one language. The Latin language unified everyone. And you could pass, and they could pass when there were struggles. For example, when the early members of the church, when early Jewish Christians suffered persecution, it was Christians in Greece and in Turkey who raised money to send help. When Paul died in Rome, he was raising money and planning a trip to travel all the way to western Spain with his hope of preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ to the very ends of the earth. And so this either good fortune or wisdom of a divine God helped Christianity to spread. And it's the reason why we today still live in Christian nations in the West. And it was influential. So let's talk about it. So I've just told you that being born during the Pax Romana would have been a good time to choose if you could go back in time. But what about if you were down here in this little province of Judea? What was it like in the Judea into which Jesus of Nazareth was born? Well, to understand what life was like, you had to know about this guy. Can anyone guess who that's a drawing of? That is Herod the Great. And this Herodian family, at the time of Jesus' birth, Herod had the lofty title of the King of the Jews. And he was called that by the Romans, a title that the New Testament would later ascribe to another. But this Herodian family that ruled over the province of Judea on behalf of the Romans, this family is intertwined with the history of the New Testament. If you read through, because Herod the Great at the top there, right? He was king at the time that Jesus was born, and he was responsible for the massacre of the innocents. His son, Herod Antipas, would be responsible for the death of the prophet John the Baptist, and would interview Jesus Christ only hours before his crucifixion. His grandson, Herod Agrippa, ordered the death of the apostle James, and was struck down in the book of Acts for his impiety. And Herod the Great's great-grandson, Herod Agrippa, would be there to hear the final testimony of Paul before he went off into imprisonment, and would say to St. Paul, "Thou hast almost convinced me to be a Christian." Now, that being said, that doesn't necessarily mean that anybody particularly liked the Herodians. So let's talk about Herod the Great. So Herod the Great was the ruler of Judea at the time. Now, I know you think it's a Roman province. Who's Herod and what is he doing there? Well, Herod was what we would call a client king. The Romans were happy to let other people run troublesome parts of their kingdom, such as Judea. And so they were happy to put in a guy as long as he made sure the Romans paid their taxes and that they kept in order, and he acknowledged the authority of Rome in all matters. He was allowed to serve as king. So how did Herod get that position? Well, Herod was king of the Jews, though he wasn't actually born in Judea. And there's sort of a story about Herod that I've heard several times, that Herod, though called king of the Jews, wasn't actually a Jew. And that's ethnically true, but probably unfair in a way, because Herod was born in the land south of Judea, what was called Idumea. But only about 100 years before Herod, the Jews in Judea had managed, under a family called the Maccabees, to break away from the empire that ruled over them. And for about 150 years had managed to maintain the first in hundreds of years, an independent Jewish kingdom. And not only had they kept it, but they had invaded the lands north and south, and in something very untypical for Jews today, they had made the peoples of those lands convert to Judaism by the sword, right? You convert or die. And so Herod's grandfather had converted to Judaism. And so Herod had been raised among these and had been a Jew. No one would say he was pious or a good Jew, but he certainly considered himself to be Jewish, though he was always sensitive about that fact. For example, only a few years before our story picks up in the New Testament, Herod went before this Sanhedrin, which was this body of Jewish elders that made decisions and rulings on cases of Jewish law. And to be friendly to them, he said, "What can I do? Advise me on how I can be a good king to the Jews." And one member, a Pharisee who was on the Sanhedrin, said, "Well, then you should step down because you're not really a Jew and you're not really a king." And so Herod did the only logical thing that you can do if you're Herod, and he immediately had every Pharisee on the Sanhedrin pulled outside and put to death. Right? So he wasn't messing around, and he was sensitive about this fact. But Herod had a specific talent. Herod's father was able to see before other people which way the wind was blowing, right? And he saw that Rome was on its way to becoming the great power in the world. And so he sent his son to ingratiate himself to the Romans. He sent his son to Rome to be educated, would send him to Roman camps and on campaign with Roman military officers. And Herod had a real talent, maybe the best talent you can have, which was he understood how to make people who could help him like him. He was charismatic and he could win over the Romans. He was friends of some of the greatest Romans of his day. In fact, he was very close friends with Mark Antony, the famous general. And in fact, when civil war broke out between Augustus and Mark Antony, Herod backed Mark Antony and Cleopatra. And then when they lost the battle, he immediately set sail for Rome, fell down at Augustus's feet and said, "Hey, I'm sorry, I backed the wrong horse. It was a big mistake." And Augustus rewarded him by making him again king over the Jewish people. And so this was Herod's domain. Now, what was it like to live under Herod? Well, the issue for Herod was, number one, that Herod was a great builder. And Herod was, and I guess we could talk about this now, Herod was one of the richest men who ever lived. Probably even till today, I don't quite know what the calculation would be, but he was fabulously wealthy, more than almost any of us can imagine. And so with this great wealth, he started massive building projects in Jerusalem. This is the Hasmonean Palace that stood in Jerusalem at the time. This was his residence there. He built Herodium, right near the Dead Sea, this massive fortress. He also built the famous fortress of Masada, which is now famous for the Jewish revolutionaries who took their own lives rather than surrender to the Romans. But all these were built with his money, and most importantly, just with his own pocket, he built the temple that was in Jerusalem. But this is the temple of Herod, the last temple that was built in Jerusalem, and it was one of the wonders of the ancient world. Every year, millions of people came to see this vast temple that Herod built. And in these courts and colonnades is where Jesus had many of his encounters and did much of his preaching. This is the temple that Jesus cleansed and where he taught many of his lessons to his people. So, and Herod built this, and there's no real indication that it was a big effort for him or a big expense. He simply had the money and easily paid to have this amazing building built. So how did Herod get his money? Does anybody know? Well, I'll tell you what he did. He got it from this. Does anybody know what this is? Okay, this is myrrh. And we're going to talk about it, and you've probably always wondered, right, about the frankincense and myrrh that were brought. And this is myrrh. I'm going to pass it around so you guys can see it. At least those of you that are here in the audience. Now, when I give it to you, it's going to look like little yellowish brown rocks, right? Myrrh is that. Frankincense comes from another source, but it looks almost exactly like that. Well, when you look at it, like I said, it's going to look like little rocks, but what it really is resin. It's tree sap. So essentially, you go to one of these plants, and farmers will go out, and they'll go to a myrrh or a frankincense plant, and they take a knife, and they make little cuts along the branches, and out bleeds this sap. And then once the sap dies, they scrape it off, and they use it. And do you know what it was used for? There we go. That's frankincense and myrrh. they're incense. They were used. So if you open up the bag and you smell them, they won't have much of a smell. They don't have it when it's that. But when you burn them, they give off a very kind of sickly sweet, it's a nice smell. I don't know how to quite describe it. It's a spicy kind of Eastern smell to it that's really enjoyable. And incense, the incense trade was incredibly important in Rome. And fortunately for Herod, all of the incense routes went through. Now, why was it so valuable, and why, for example, did the wise men think that this would be an appropriate gift? Well, the issue is that incense became incredibly important in Rome, and for several reasons, but one of the major reasons is that Rome was a city of more than 1 million people at this time, and Rome had all of its great buildings and many wonderful features. What it didn't have was a sewer. And so people would just empty their chamber pots and whatever else trash they had into the gutters in the side of the street. And you just hope every once in a while a big rain would come and wash everything down to the Tiber. But you could imagine, if you were in Rome, especially in the summer, what the city smelled like. And so Romans would combat this by having little pots of this incense slowly burning in their house, and it would give off this nice smell that would cover that up. And that itself made them valuable, but there was something else that made frankincense and myrrh such valuable gifts or such valuable items, and that was Roman funeral practices. So when a famous Roman died, the Roman religion had just hundreds of little rituals and prescriptions and things you had to do, rules governing how the body was laid out, what hymns need to be sung, how long these mourners would go, and the more important the person was, the longer the list of these things got. And so if an extremely important person died, it could take up to 9 days for all the rituals to be carried out. Well, you can imagine what happened with the body after that amount of time. Yeah, it would start to smell, and so they would burn these incense. And what happened is they started burning these incense, and as more and more of it was demanded, the price went up and up. And the more the price went up, the more the Romans wanted it. And so until by this time, a wealthy Roman was burning hundreds of pounds of myrrh and frankincense at every funeral, and the more the price went up, the more it became a status symbol to show others how much you could burn, right? And they're burning up all this, and the supply completely outstripped the demand until by Jesus' time, the incense trade is a $40 billion industry in the Roman Empire in terms of our money today. And all of that money came right through Herod's domain in Judea. And so the price of this had gone so high that it's probably pretty clear that of the 3 gifts, the gold, the frankincense, and the myrrh, it probably wasn't the gold that was the most valuable thing that was brought to the baby Jesus by the Magi. And so we start our story. So now we understand this world. So I guess I should finish with one other point about Herod. So as Herod got older, he grew increasingly suspicious, increasingly paranoid, and spiteful. So we know that he had at least 4 of his sons put to death because he suspected them of plotting against him or wanting his throne. He killed several nephews, his favorite wife, and his mother-in-law. So which maybe we shouldn't be surprised about, but that was the case. So I think my favorite one was his final son that he executed. Herod was dying, probably of kidney failure, and he'd been dying for several days, and word got around to his oldest son, his heir, that his dad had died. And so his son immediately called for a feast and threw a huge party. Only the problem is that Herod hadn't died yet. And when word got around to him that his son had thrown a party to celebrate his death, he immediately sent guards and had his son executed from his deathbed, right? Just to make sure that that was established. So Herod had quite an impressive reputation for violence. In fact, we know that this is actually documented because we know that when word of Herod's fratricidal killing, right, his killing of all of his children, that when Augustus Caesar was told about it, that Augustus Caesar made a joke about it. It's a joke that works in Greece because of the similarity of the words, but he said, "I would rather be one of Herod's pigs than one of Herod's sons." which tells us two things. Number one, Augustus was aware of Herod's reputation, and also he was aware that Jews didn't eat pork, right? Because being a Jew's pig would not be a good situation. And so this was Herod, and this was the kingdom in which they lived, and it was one that was enforced by fear and violence. It was one that was constantly fractured when our story starts. And so into this world, the New Testament throws us. And it starts us with a young woman, and she's pregnant. And this is Mary, of course. And let me see if I remember to put the text in. Right? And we have Mary, and it starts, this is Matthew 1, or sorry, this is Luke. It says, "And the angel said unto her, Fear not, Mary, for thou hast found favor with God. And behold, thou hast conceived in thy womb, and bring forth a son, and shalt call his name Jesus." So let's draw a couple of points. By the way, first of all, is her name Mary? Her name isn't Mary. That's our English version of her name. Her name is actually, it's the name of the sister of Moses, and was a really important name. Her name is Miriam. It's still today one of the most common Jewish names, and it was at that time too, because it had become a traditional belief among the Jews that the mother of the promised Messiah would be named Mary, would be named Miriam. So if you think about the women who appear in the New Testament, the disciples of Jesus, right? I think of the 5 named female disciples, 4 of them are named Mary, right? You have a certain Mary, you have Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus, you have Mary Magdalene, and of course his mother, Mary. So it seems like a lot of Jews, just to cover their bases, because there was this prophecy, they just went ahead and named their daughters Miriam, just in case. Just to make sure. Now that might seem like it would be confusing unless any of you have ever spent any time in South America. And you'll meet a family and the dad's like, "Oh, these are my daughters, Maria Teresa, Maria Luisa, and Maria Sol." Like all of their daughters are named Maria, and then they're just called by their middle names, right? So Miriam is her name, and this angel appears to her in her room and says, right, and tells her this. And she gives a response, but Mary said, "Behold." Oh, I'm sorry, she does ask one question of the angel, and it shows a little bit of Mary's temperament. We don't know much about her, but she doesn't say, "What? Why me? Why are you doing this?" She doesn't have any of the questions. She simply asks, "How is this going to be possible?" Right? "I'm not yet married. I've known no man." And the angel tells her, "The Spirit of the Lord will come upon you." And then Mary gives this answer, which tells a little bit more about her feelings on it. It says, "And Mary said, Behold the handmaiden of the Lord, be it unto me according to thy word." And the angel departed from her. So she says, now the King James Version offers us the kind of gentle word there of saying, "I am your handmaid." The word she uses, the Greek says "doue," which is slave. Right? In other words, she says, you are God, and I don't get a choice to say. I will do whatever I'm commanded to do. So it shows her spirit, but that doesn't change the fact that now, with this miracle occurred, she's pregnant. And she's been engaged to be married to a man named Joseph. Now, I've always been curious. I would have loved to see how this conversation went down, right? As she tries to explain to Joseph how it's possible that she's pregnant and yet not married. But it seems that we can glean from this text that Joseph doesn't believe her, right? He's not stupid. He finds out that she's pregnant, and they're engaged to be married. And Matthew makes an interesting statement here. He says, "And then Joseph, her husband, being a just man, and not willing to make a public example, was minded to put her away privately," or privily. Now, why does that make him a just man? Why is that duty put in there? She says he's a good man, so he's going to put her away privately, which tells us a little bit about the world into which this is happening, which is what could have been Joseph's option. Yeah, well, actually, he has a whole lot of options, but the easiest one would be to simply publicly humiliate her, right? To take her and denounce her in front of the community. right, as having committed this adultery. But this went quite a long way. They were promised to be married, and the Jews took this very seriously. If you were promised to be married, this was almost like being married. As you were preparing yourself for marriage, if one party was to commit adultery, well, if Joseph had gone to the judges and insisted, had he not been a just man and wanted vengeance against Mary, the ultimate punishment, the worst punishment in the law of Moses, was reserved for women who violated the promise of their engagement, who committed adultery. You'll remember the woman who was also engaged, who was taken in adultery and brought into the temple. What did they want to do to her? Yeah, Joseph could have had her stoned if he chose to. But instead, now he believes at this point that their agreement has been broken, the marriage is off, but he says, right, rather than to shame her or take any of the measures he could, he decides, I'll just quietly end our engagement so she won't suffer any more wrath. So that shows that a little bit of his spirit and his willingness not to torment this poor girl. And we should point this out. They're now engaged to be married. Well, following Jewish customs and what we can kind of glean from the words, how old is Mary when this is happening? Yeah, she's about 14. How old's Joseph? He's probably about 30 at the time that they're married. Now, I always feel, whenever I say this, I always feel like the audience pull back a little bit, like, whoa, okay? Right? And I do want to just really quickly, and not diverge too far, but I do want to explain this. Why is it, until very recently in history, it was very common in almost every culture that older men, right, married very young women. Women that today would make us uncomfortable, and we look at that and go, and there's kind of a modern feminist take on it, that we put our spin on history and we go, oh, well, it's because men ruled society and old men always want to sleep with young girls, so that must be the reason. But I can tell you that really isn't fair, or really what was going on here. Why was it always the case in so many ways that very young women were being pushed into being married? Well, it really had to do with the fact that women in this time, and well, everyone in this time, lived with a reality that we almost cannot even understand today. And that was that, number one, life expectancy was short. Most people didn't live into their 50s. And the child mortality rate was extremely high. Meaning at most times in history, as many as 40% of your children would die before they reached adulthood. And you just had to accept that. Today, if we meet someone who's even lost one child, we view that as a terrible tragedy because of the advances of modern medicine, and vaccines have made that something we can't fathom. But it was totally normal to meet, most women had lost 2, 3, 4 babies, as many as 7 children. Imagine if you met someone today who had 4 children die. But that was their reality. Almost nobody made it through family life without losing some of their babies along the way. And so the result was that for women, the only way that you could ensure that you had children that survived and could have a family, and for Jews, passing on this covenant to them was really important. So the only way that you could ensure that was to have as many babies as you could. And given your life expectancy, you didn't have a very big window. And so girls were encouraged to start a family and start having children as early as possible, with the hope that enough of them would survive to continue your family. You had to start at a very early age. But for men, the opposite was the case. Do we want 14-year-old boys to start having kids? No, absolutely not. Right? Who's going to take care of these kids? And so men had the marriages for men were pushed off, and they were told to delay and wait to get married until they were established, until they had training in a career or a profession, until they had a home that they could provide to bring a wife into. So that's the reason for this great disparity. But either way, right, they are now married. Now, what happens to Mary and to Joseph? Well, first of all, to Joseph, at first he's intending to break off the marriage, and what happens? Well, he has a dream, and it says, the angel appears to him. Now notice in all of these cases, I almost didn't notice this until I was reading through it, and it always says the angel when an angel appears in the story, not an angel, not a angel. So I think the impression here is that it's all the same angel, right? That it's Gabriel who appears to each of them. But in a dream, an angel appears to him and says, no, take her to wife. Essentially tells him, she's telling the truth. She has been faithful to you, but this is the work of the Lord. And so that convinces him. Now, when he tells Mary, when the angel tells Mary, immediately after telling her that she's going to bear a child, she says also, your cousin is also going to have a child. And that's a cousin, Elizabeth, there we go. Sorry, it took me a second. Elizabeth, your cousin Elizabeth has a child. Why does the angel tell her that? It is John the Baptist. She's the mother, and they've also had a miraculous angelic visitation that has resulted in John the Baptist. But it's an interesting detail that the angel tells her right after you did it. Also, your cousin is going to, and this is there. Can anyone think of a more logistical reason for her why that would be? Well, that might be her who's supposedly had it in age, but this is for Mary. Because what does Mary do after Joseph receives his dream? She goes away, right? She goes to visit Elizabeth. And there they have this great union. There's a prayer in there called the Magnificat. Supposedly the infant in her womb, John the Baptist, leaps when Mary comes close, right? This great story. But can we see kind of a practical, if you can think a little bit, if you've read history or you like Victorian dramas on the BBC, I probably don't have to tell you the meaning of a young girl going away to visit an aunt, right, in a distant country. Well, clearly, while Joseph may be certainly convinced about the truth of Mary, does that mean the other people in Nazareth are? No. And so we can see that already she's fearful of this scorn. I think that's why the angel tells her, hey, your cousin, she'll believe you. Because they've had their own visitation and they'll believe it. And so Mary is able to go away to avoid some of that scorn and visit her cousin and has this good time with them. So from there, we'll start with what most of us know from Luke 2, which most of us know as the Nativity story. And I want to point out something of how this story begins. So Luke 2 begins with the famous line, and it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. And this tax was first made when Cyrenius was governor of Syria, and all went to be taxed, every one into their own city. So this is the beginning of the story, and I'm pointing this out. First of all, let's talk about this. It says a tax, and all people went to be taxed, and maybe there was a small poll tax, but what is this really that's going on? Yeah, this is a census. The Romans were thorough administrators, and they knew if you were going to levy taxes over your new provinces, what did you have to know? You got to know who's there, how many people. And so they kept these accurate records. But it begins with this line, right? This census which goes. Now, the Romans certainly didn't care where you enrolled in the census. The Roman fashion would just be whatever city you're in. But we see that it says everyone goes to his own city. This was a concession by the Romans to the Jews, which is the Jews, whenever they took censuses or paid taxes, they always did it by family in their family line. And so to smooth things over, they said, okay, you can do it in the typical Jewish fashion. Go to wherever your people are from, wherever your family's from, and that's where you'll do the enrollment. And so they go to be taxed. Now, what I want to point out on this is that I think there's a little bit of an art here that Luke is using, and I think it goes overlooked by most of us who read it, is that it starts, who's the character that starts this thing off? It starts with Caesar Augustus. And it says, and a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world, they mean all the Roman world, but the point here is that this decree goes out that all the Romans, that everyone needs to go to their city to be enrolled and pay taxes. On whose command? On Caesar Augustus. So this is put out there to show the power and prestige of Caesar Augustus, right? All this worldly power is instilled in him. And just to understand a little bit what the readers of this would have known of Augustus. So if you read in the Aeneid, written by Virgil, it goes through the ancient history of Rome, and it gets all the way up to Augustus, and this is how Augustus is treated in the Aeneid. It says, "But next, behold the youth of form divine, Caesar himself exalted in his line. Augustus promised oft and long foretold, sent to the realm that gods ruled of old, born to restore an age of gold." So during this time, Augustus was very carefully managing his reputation and how people viewed him. And they were already beginning, as we'll see, to view Roman emperors as being gods, as touched by gods, and as being divine. And so that starts off with this story of Augustus, right, in all his might, simply issuing a decree that all the world must be taxed and enrolled, that everyone must obey him. And in these 3 lines, he tells us when and where. But then look how quickly Luke shifts it. "And Joseph also went up to Galilee, out of the city of Nazareth unto Judea, and unto the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be taxed with Mary, his espoused wife, who was great with child." And you can see a little bit of Luke's art as he structures this, of contrasting, right? He starts off by saying the majesty of Rome and Augustus, right? Whose name literally August means great, lifted up above everyone else. The great Augustus issuing his decree, and then he contrasts that with who the story is really about, immediately shifting it to no, it's not Augustus on his throne dictating to all the world, right? But right here, this little family is the focus. And so he shifts it immediately to Joseph and Mary, setting out on their journey. Now, to take this journey, probably most of you have wondered, at this point, is this an easy journey to take with a wife who's 9 months pregnant? No. And yet he brings her with him as they make their way down from the Galilee, which is up here, all the way, well, up there, and then down, right, past, and Jerusalem is there, and past that to Bethlehem. They would have gone down probably this western road that goes right down the Jordan River Valley, and then up around Jerusalem and down to Bethlehem. This is mountainous and rough country, and he decides to take his very pregnant wife with him. Why? I'll tell you, the law didn't say that he and his wife had to come and enroll, right? Just like our government forms today, the Romans just required that the head of household come and appeal. So Joseph could have made this journey by himself, but instead he takes Mary with him. Now, obviously later readers would see this as a fulfillment of prophecy, but there's no indication that Joseph knew that this was going to be the Messiah who needed to be born in Bethlehem. Why does he take Mary with him? Well, again, I think this is a reflection of his goodness and his kindness, because to leave Mary in Nazareth means to leave her exposed to the judgment and the rejection of the community. Because even if he has decided to marry her, in the eyes of her community, she's the adulteress. And he wishes to shield her from that. So even though even as she gets close to her pregnancy, he's unwilling to leave her alone to face that. And so he takes her on this dangerous journey. As they pass down through the valley of Jordan, and down, they would have passed along the western edge of Jerusalem, and passed over the bridge over the stream at Kidron. This, ironically, is the same bridge over which Mary's son will pass as he's led down from Gethsemane in chains towards his execution. And they'll pass to the little town of Bethlehem. Bethlehem sits about 6 miles south of the city of Jerusalem. And although I always love, whenever you find pictures of it in postcards, I always love the desert oasis look that it has with the palm trees. Right? This is what Bethlehem looks like. It's rocky and stony country. It's not good for farming. It's a poor country. Bethlehem in Hebrew, by the way, Beth means house. Bethlehem is the house of bread, is what its name. But Bethlehem had a special meaning for the Jewish people. And that's because who had come out of the little city of Bethlehem? King David had. King David was a shepherd in Bethlehem and had been chosen to be the king of all Israel. And so this place had special meaning. And also the prophet Micah and Nahum, I think, several of the ancient prophets had prophesied that one day when the Jewish Messiah came, that it would be here in Bethlehem. Micah in chapter 5 says, "O Bethlehem, though they're the smallest or the tiniest of Judah, yet shall a ruler come from thee." And so this place had special meaning, but at this time of year, what's the city look like? Well, I'll tell you, it's jam-packed because everyone who has family and descendants from this town now has to make their way back to this little village in order to be enrolled for the census. And so when they find their way there, famously they're unable to find any lodging. The town is completely full of travelers, and they arrive, and it, of course, resists. And so it was that let me start that again. And so it was that while they were there, the days were accomplished that she should be delivered. And she brought forth her firstborn son and wrapped him in swaddling clothes and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them at the inn. And so we know, unable to find any place in the stable, in the inn, one of the innkeepers or possibly a relative, right, offers them to sleep in a stable. Now today, we always have these pictures of a stable. If you have a nativity set, it typically looks just like this, right? These big wooden stables. I think when we hear the word stable, we imagine something like this, where they're sleeping, right? However, can anyone think of a problem with this in Palestine? That's right. There is not a lot of trees in Palestine. And so when we see these big wooden, the famous, and these wooden crutches, we know it wouldn't have looked like that. Most of our Christmas traditions in America come from Northern Europe. So when we think of a barn, that's the way they thought of it and pictured it like this. But this is what the hillside looks like outside of Bethlehem. And all along the hillside, there's still stables that have been used for thousands of years, that are dug straight into the side of the mountain. So literally a cave was dug into the side of the mountain and hollowed out, and then a door was put across the front. Here's some Bedouin travelers staying in an inn, just like the original family did. So the stable in which she gave birth and in which Jesus of Nazareth was born didn't look so much like this as it looked like this. And it would have been filled with all the animals, right, and everything else that was there. And this was not obviously a condition that anyone would want to have a child in. Now, I should say probably we shouldn't consider this to be a position of absolute destitute as the way we would see it today. People back then were a little tougher than they are now. They expected to kind of have to rough it a little bit more than we might. So this is not the worst possible conditions that could happen, but still, I don't think any woman looking at this would think, hey, that's a place I want to have a baby. Right? And so here in that lowly stable, right, like a cave carved out of a hillside overlooking the valley of Jezreel, Jesus of Nazareth is born. And Matthew tells us, and he called his name Jesus. Is that what he called him? Is that his name? What is his name? Well, we say Jesus. That's our English version, but we get our English name from his name in Latin, which is Iesu. So we take that, but the Romans in turn, that wasn't their name either. They got it from the Greeks. That's his name in Greek, which is Jesus, is what the Greeks call him. But even that is not his name. That is the Greek version of his name in Aramaic. His name in Aramaic is this. I'm sure you can all read that. You've all brushed up on your Syriac before you came in. Huh? Okay. It's this. And that's pronounced Yesheu. His name is Yesheu. If you were to see him and meet him at that time, that's what he would have been known by. And we actually are more familiar with this name than we think. Yesheu is the name of another Old Testament prophet. Does anybody know what prophet it is? Yeah. Joshua. His name is Joshua, is Yesheu. And that name actually turns out to be appropriate and it fits into the text because Joshua in Hebrew means Savior. That's why the angel says to Mary, "You shall have a son and name him Jesus, for he shall be a savior of his people to save them from his sins." Right? His name is Savior. Right? So his name is Yesheu. Now, in the hillsides around that place, around where the stable sat, there were shepherds. Now, shepherds were famous from coming from Bethlehem, of course, because David himself, the king, had been shepherds. I don't know if that really is that there's anything good about being a shepherd from Bethlehem, except that the ground is just too rocky to farm anything really effectively. So you're not left with a whole lot of options. And so shepherds had always lived in that region south of Jerusalem. And these shepherds had lived and worked there since the time when since the Jews had first arrived in this area. Now, shepherds actually were not very well thought of or well regarded within Jewish society. They were kind of seen as outsiders. And the reason is that shepherds were, in some senses, sort of homeless. They had to move around with their sheep, moving their sheep from pasture to pasture, and that cut them off from the religious and social life in their community. And so shepherds tended to be isolated and to associate only with one another. And so we can see in this the fact that Luke, who put this story together from his eyewitness accounts that he met, finds it takes a lot of interest in this story of the shepherds, right, and why they're important. Because Luke, unlike a lot of the other gospel writers, Luke was not a Jew, nor had he ever been one of Christ's disciples while he was alive. He'd never met Jesus. Luke was converted by Paul, and had gained a testimony, and when he took time to compile his gospel, he was a doctor, a physician it's called, and he went out and interviewed everybody that he could find, all of the people that were still alive and still were members of the church who remembered Jesus. And he collected their stories, and that's why Luke has stories from third parties that we don't see in any of the other gospels. Because to Luke, it was important to portray Jesus and show how he had been sent not just to the house of Israel, but to the outcast, to the poor, to people like him, who hadn't been part of that first covenant, right? But had come to gain faith in Jesus Christ. And so in this story we see the angel appeared to the shepherds. Now, there is one thing, though, while I have told you that shepherds weren't highly regarded, the shepherds here in Bethlehem enjoyed a slightly higher status than shepherds did in many other parts of Judea. And the reason is because the sheep that were raised near Bethlehem, just south of Jerusalem, were the flocks that were chosen first, and their sheep had a special purpose. They were intended for sacrifices in the temple. And so every year they would bring every year these shepherds would bring their sheep up to Jerusalem. And only the most spotless and most perfect were selected out of their flocks to be sacrificed on the high holy days. And so there is an underlying theme here as we see shepherds brought into this. We can see Christ as the friend, or as coming to the outcast, as having a special message to outsiders. But also there's a reference, and one of the reasons Luke includes this is because it is the Christian belief that Christ was the final sacrifice. That at Christ's death, that sacrifice lost its religious reason for being. And so ultimately, it's Jesus who is the final lamb who will go. And so as they're sleeping, watching their flocks at night, it says, "And lo, the angel of the Lord came upon them, and the glory of the Lord showed round about them, and they were sore afraid. And the angel said unto them, Fear not, for behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy, which shall be to all people. For unto you this day in the city of David is born a Savior, who is Christ the Lord. And this shall be a sign unto you, that ye shall find the babe wrapped in swaddling clothes and lying in a manger." And then the story goes on to say that the angel then vanishes and is replaced with the singing of an angelic choir, shouting, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill towards men," which is the message that he would hope to bring. And the shepherds then go and make their way in, and they find the sign when they find the stable in the side of the hill with a baby lying in a manger. Now, what's a manger? Well, a better word for us, we would say it's a trough. I often heard people say, well, the manger, and think of it as kind of the whole crèche, right? The whole stable and everything. But that's the manger. Jesus laid him in a manger because, again, this is a stable. This is where you put food for the animals, and it creates this. Now, once again, I think our kind of Northern European traditions affect our thinking, because we have this thing, and in almost all of our pictures, it's typically made out of wood. Well, in the area around Bethlehem, there's been lots of archaeological digs, and we've found quite a few of these mangers, except they're all made of stone, not of wood. That was simply an easier material for them to have, and so likely the manger that he's laid in is not wood, but rather stone, and he's laid in on top of the soft hay. The story tells us that he's wrapped in swaddling clothes. Right? What are swaddling clothes? Actually, that should be better translated as swaddling bands. In any way, most of us here who have had children have probably swaddled a baby, right? Where you do that tuck and pull thing you do with the baby to tie him into the blanket. Well, the Jews would use bands, which were basically long strips. So after the baby was born, they would then wrap these long bands around the baby. And the idea was to keep the baby not only safe and secure and in one's place, but to comfort the child, right? Because it was much more like the mother's womb to be bound in tight like this, and that's what babies need. So he's wrapped in swaddling clothes, swaddling bands. Now, we can't really say for certain if this was the tradition at the time Jesus was born, but it certainly was a later tradition of the Jews that continues today, which is that Jewish mothers would typically sew or embroider into the bands. So as they were pregnant waiting for the baby to be born, they would take the time to sew patterns into these things for their babies. And usually those patterns would have information about the baby's lineage, usually about their family. So Jesus being born through both sides of his family through the line of David might have had his swaddling bands embroidered with symbols for the house of David, which might be a lion or an olive branch to represent the branches of Israel. Now, we can't, like I said, we can't say, we don't know if this was a tradition at the time or if this developed only a few hundred years later, but I do like the idea of Mary waiting for the birth of her child, sitting alone quietly sewing these beautiful patterns into the bands in which she'll finally wrap her child. So those of you that watch the promo know I sing at this part, right? So most of you have probably heard this have heard this. This is a famous Christmas song, right? We three kings of Orient are. No applause, please. But seriously, what's wrong with this famous hymn? Well, the problem is that they weren't kings. There weren't three of them, and we don't really know if they're from the East or not. But the Magi come into it through the Gospel of Matthew. So what do we know about the Magi? Now, when I say they're not kings, right, they aren't, but what are they? Well, Magi, you can hear in that name, Magi, right, is our root word for what? Magic, right, and magician. So who are they? Well, the easy answer would be magicians, but that's not quite what it means. These aren't pull a rabbit out of your hat magicians, right? These were an important part of the ancient world. The Magi are essentially they're fortune tellers, or they're seers who people believed could predict the future. And these were all over in the ancient world. Now, so every royal court, every even just wealthy families would keep one or two of these magi around who were supposed to be able to read the signs and tell you portents of what was coming in the future. Now, and most of them used, especially the ones that are here, as we're going to see, used astrology. Right? In other words, people believed in ancient times that studying the movement of the stars and the heavens would give you clues to what things were going to happen. Now, today, all of us would probably agree that astrology is kind of a pseudoscience, but for this time, this was considered fairly wise. Well, the reason why they're called wise men. Because in order to be a good soothsayer, a good fortune teller, you couldn't just randomly make this stuff up. You had to study the world around you. You had to know the movement of stars. You had to keep accurate records of your time. If the last king died when Jupiter was in the third house ascending, well, the next time you see that, you better be able to warn the current king that, hey, just so you know, last time this happened. And so most of them tended to actually be fairly astute, almost scientists in their age. They didn't have real science the way that we have it, but for them, these were wise men. These were people who people went to consult. And they knew it not just by watching only for signs, but by studying the world around them and giving sound advice and counsel and warning. And so there wouldn't be any king or any noble person in the court that didn't have these magi around to counsel them and advise them. And so these magi come, they come. Now, we always have this, now we typically think this is where the Orient are part of it, are the magi from the East? Well, we're not really sure if they're from the East or not. What the text actually says is, they say, first of all, it's ambiguous in English. It says, we saw the star in the East. And it says that in both English and the Greek, which could mean either we were in the East and we saw the star, therefore they were in the East, or we saw the star in the East, meaning they were west of Jerusalem or Bethlehem when they saw the star. It does say, but probably most people would conclude that even that term, we saw the star in the East, is not actually referring to the location of where they were or even where the star was. That could probably be translated as, we saw the star at its rising. Right? Just like the sun and moon, right, rise in the east, right? We saw the star rising at that night. That was the day that it rose. And so we don't really know exactly where they're from or where they saw this. So they saw a star and they set out. Now, it might interest some of you to know that in the early Christian tradition, as Christianity became more established, usually when the wise men are depicted, they're depicted wearing Roman togas. Early Christians thought that these were Roman, or people from the Roman Empire going to pay their allegiance. But the truth is, we don't really know. Now, all of that being said, I'm going to say I think that the Bible and the traditional assertion that they are from the East is right. And the reason that I say that is because of what sign they saw. The ancient world had tons of different ways that people believed you'd be able to tell the future, right, by studying it. I mean, the Romans typically would sacrifice a sheep and then look at its liver, and by its spots or marks or however it was, they believed you could divine things, or you could watch birds in the sky. They had all these systems, but especially in the East, the following of stars, especially in Babylon, was important. Fortune tellers from the East, or I should say magi from the East, studied the stars and the patterns and believed that the stars would portend great things. And so most likely, I think it would fit more that they are called by this star they see because they're studying the stars. Now, there's no indication, however, that any of these people are Hebrews. They're not Jews. I mean, they're pretty much established as being foreigners from another place. So why? Why are they coming to visit even if they believe that it's the Jewish Messiah, what are they doing? Well, Judaism had quite an influence, especially in the East, throughout the Middle East. So if you'll remember your history from the Old Testament, right, the Jews were captured in Babylon and carried far into the East. And eventually they were freed, but while they were in the East, they spread out. And many of them actually did fairly well for themselves and remained. When many Jews returned back to the Holy Land, many of them stayed. For example, even as late as the Persian Empire, we have the story of Esther, right? She's a Jew all the way in what's Iran. And so these Jewish synagogues had spread all over the West, all over the Middle East. And in the Middle East, there was a belief where Jews were cut off from the temple and from the many trappings of their religion and found themselves instead strangers in strange lands, constantly worried for their community. And many of them, those Jews in the East, began to believe strongly that there would come a Jewish Messiah, that this prophecy would come to fulfill and bring all of the houses of Israel back together. And this belief became so prevalent that not only did Jews believe it, but also other people. This idea that a great Messiah, a great leader was going to come from among the Jewish people, and that he would put the world right and fix it, had spread to other religions in the East. And so when these men, though they may not be Jews, see the star, we're not sure why, but they see the signs and they immediately interpret it as, this is the promised Messiah. And they set out. So these men who see this, now, when and what was the star? I mean, I think we could all ask this question, and we can't really be sure. I mean, there's certainly lots of astrological events that could have happened. People have theorized a comet or a supernova could have appeared in the sky. I think one of the most famous one is the famous German astrologer Kepler. Johann Kepler worked out the math in studying the movement of planets, and he worked out that just before the birth of Jesus, that three major stars, that Venus, Jupiter, and Mars all conjoined. In other words, they all happened to be moving on courses and came together to make one, which would have made one pretty impressive, bright, shining star, which is a good candidate. Now, the only thing I can tell you about his theory, though I like that one, if Kepler is right, that does put Jesus' birth a little bit earlier, because that probably happened around 5 BC. So if that's the case, then Jesus was born a little earlier than we think, though we can't be certain what time. But it could have been almost any event. And I don't know that we can be 100% certain if the star, because the star could simply be a spiritual manifestation that only they see. As you'll remember, when they set out and find him in Bethlehem, the star is shining directly over the place where Jesus is, right? There isn't a star that moves in front of your house, and yet it seems to move to guide them to where they're supposed to go. So whether this is an astrological event or a spiritual event, I don't know if we're supposed to know, but that's mostly all we know about the wise men. Now, I teased you all by saying there weren't 3 of them. Well, the fact is, we have no idea how many wise men there were, because magi is just plural. Magus is the singular. So magi means 2 or more. And we don't know how many of them were said. Why do we typically say 3? I think you can all guess. Because 3 gifts are mentioned, right? The gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So typically the 3 wise men is there. But for all we know, there could have been 5. There could have been 7. Nothing says that more than one didn't bring the same gift or that they didn't all bring similar gifts or what. But for this reason, and so the tradition of the Magi has gone on. You can kind of see here are starting very early. They're often associated with different places. Many of your nativity sets, if you buy today, will usually, if you look close, one of the wise men will be black, who's typically from Ethiopia. Incidentally, his name is Balthazar. Then there's Melchior, who's sort of a tan skin, and then there's sort of a light-skinned one named Casper, after the friendly ghost, I'm assuming. But you can see right here in this early Christian painting, right? You can notice that each one of the wise men is portrayed at a different color. And this is to fulfill, they see it, I think, as a fulfillment of the prophecies that say, right, of the 4 corners of the earth, right, coming, and the kings kneeling before the King of Kings. So here's my star. Okay, so we're almost at our end now, and I can see our time. We've got to move through this quickly. What happens to these magi? Well, they arrive in Jerusalem, and knowing that magi typically advise kings, who do they go to first? They go to Herod and say, "Hey, Herod, we saw the star. I'm sure you've seen it. We saw the star, and we made this journey. Where's the king that we're supposed to be here to worship?" And Herod goes, "The what now?" He says, "The new king that we're here to worship." And Herod says, so what does Herod say? He goes, well, yeah, the new king. Hey, you go and find him, and when you find him, make sure you come back and tell me so that I have an opportunity to also adore him, right? And so the wise men then set out, and they go. But once again, we can see this theme, right, where the foreigner or the outsider recognizes the signs and comes to find Jesus when Herod and his own Jewish people don't see the signs. That's the theme that's being put forward here in the Gospels. And so they come. Now, the wise men then find them, not in Nazareth, but where are they still when the wise men get there? Well, Matthew tells us that they stay in Bethlehem after the baby's born, right? They decide we're not going back up to Nazareth at this time, and they visit him. Now, most of our nativity scenes, again, that we have show the wise men appearing usually on camels, which is just funny, but the camels of coming, and the wise men being there at the birth with the baby Jesus. But is that actually what happened? Yeah, actually, if you read the Bible story, that's not even actually when it happened. When do the wise men show up? Not for quite a while after. In fact, if you look at the text, they see the star when he's born, and just then they make provisions and set out. It takes them quite a while to actually get to Jerusalem and to find him. So in reality, by the time the wise men appear and give the gifts, Jesus has been living in Bethlehem with his parents. He's almost a toddler at this time when these gifts are presented. Now, interestingly, I told you that Luke, who records this story, wrote his gospel off of interviews he'd taken with people who was there. And his amount of detail that he has about the life and events of Jesus' early life tends to indicate traditionally that who is the source for his information? Mary. Yeah, Mary was still alive at this time. Right? One of the upsides of having children young, right, is you're still around later when you have a chance to embarrass them later on in life. So the wise men come and they make this delivery. Now, after they give these gifts, which we've told you are extremely precious, and also they're going to come in a lot of handy for the new family, because unintentionally, who of the wise men tipped off that, hey, there's this prophesied king? Well, they tipped off Herod, right? And so the family will need this money, because then, as the wise men are departing, it says they stay there and they have a dream. And again, the angel warns them, don't go back to Herod. And so it says instead they depart and go to their own land. And at the same time then, Joseph is warned in a dream that Herod will be looking for them, and so he sets out. Where does the family go, incidentally? Yeah, the family goes to Egypt. And what do they escape? Well, Herod finds out that these wise men have made a visit to somebody and then left, and he's furious that they've refused to come back and report. And so he calls together all his counselors and says, hey, if this prophesied king was to be born, looking at the Old Testament, where is he going to be born? And they all answer him, in Bethlehem. And so he sends soldiers, and what does he do? And this is why this gives us a clue of how long it took the wise men to get there. When I say he was older than an infant when he got there, what does Herod order? That all the male babies be killed under the age of what? 2. So it's been almost 2 years since Jesus was born. So he's working out the math from what they've told, and you have, this is typically called the slaughter of the innocents, right? That these babies are rounded up. Now, some historians have looked at this and said, well, we don't believe that this story happened because there isn't a record of it. If Herod had ordered this, then somebody would have recorded this as a horrible thing that happened. I'm not inclined to believe that, because just knowing what I've told you so far about Herod, Bethlehem was not a very big town. At most, it probably had around 200 people, which means even if they did kill the infants, how many children could there be in that community under 2 years of age? So this slaughter of the innocents might be only a few children, maybe a half dozen children are killed on Herod's orders. And that sort of thing, unfortunately, in a life as violent as Herod's, just might not have even had been important in the record books. There just wouldn't have been something that would have even been recorded. And it is important, though, and I think the reason why Matthew includes it is there is a great flip at the end of this chapter, which is you have this first family and Jesus, who will be the bearer of the new covenant, fleeing the Holy Land to go to where? Yeah, in a perfect contrast to Moses, right, where Moses led his people of the covenant out of Egypt into the Holy Land. And so there is this returning back to the normal. So what can we take from this story? Well, I hope, obviously, if you've stuck with it through this whole time, that you've learned a few things about the Nativity story and have a little bit more of an understanding of it. But I think the reason why this story has stayed is not just that its religious value, that it tells the birth of Jesus, who's been such an influential figure and who's changed the world, but that it is, in the end, a profoundly human story. Luke and Matthew were brilliant in the way they told this story so that we could understand it. And all of us can listen to this story and see ourselves in these characters. Most of the people here can sympathize with being a young mother, with holding that infant in your arms and all its infinite possibilities. Most of us can sympathize with Joseph, with a young father for his first time, who's looking at his responsibilities and whether he'll be able to care for the family that has been brought into this world. Ultimately, it's a story that touches all of us because it's about humanity, and it's about new life being brought into this world with all its limitless miracles and potential put before us. And so I hope we'll take some time to think about that. If we're religious, I hope we'll think of the impact that Jesus had. And even if we're not religious, I hope we'll take time to think about his message and what it has to teach us. That has to teach us, it's a message about hope and about the future. And a hope for something that all of us want. Because this baby would grow up to teach a lesson that we've never quite fully understood or reached, but we've never quite forgotten. That one day there might be a kingdom in which the low can sit down with the high, in which all men will be treated with respect and love and kindness. And that one day at last we may have peace on earth, goodwill towards men. Thank you.